Welcome to Our Canada, Our Future. I'm Aaron Woodrick. On today's show, we're going to be talking about the Pope's recent visit to Canada to apologize for the Catholic Church's role in the tragedy that was Canada's Indian residential school system. And to discuss it, I'm very pleased to be joined by Melissa Mbarki, a policy analyst at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on your show today.
Melissa, before we get into your thoughts on the Pope's visit, I thought it might be helpful for viewers to know a bit about your own story and your own connection to the residential school system.
So I grew up in a community that has or did have an open residential school. I went to school with these children. They were part of our community when they were at the school. And, the kind of lives that they lived after they left was very tragic. And, to see them growing up, dealing with all kinds of, social and economic issues, it was just a really sad thing to watch, not only in my community, but in other communities as well. My grandma's also a survivor of a residential school. So we've seen that, trickle through our family. And we've seen the devastation that it did cause within my own family. And I look at her relationship with my mother, and it was often very trying. So, you know, I've seen the impacts that these schools have had, not only on the individual but on communities as well. And it wasn't a very good experience, seeing it firsthand. But what I can take from that, are the challenges that we face, and also advocating for what we need in our communities.
So yeah, some firsthand experience that you have with this. It's a very personal issue. So I guess I wanted to ask you then, when you first heard that the Pope, because I know there had been demands for a long time that the Catholic Church should apologize. When you first heard that he was coming to apologize, what was your reaction?
I thought, the timing of it was off. They could have done this, they could have made this apology when the last school had closed in 1997. My grandma wasn't around to hear it, but, I embraced it on her behalf. I think it would have been something that she would have wanted to hear as a survivor. It maybe would have helped her put closure to some of the things that she experienced. And if for some, accounts from other survivors, it was what they needed to hear to heal. So it had its benefits, to the survivors, but then there were some who thought it was just another apology, and it was just another day. And, there's been mixed reactions in our communities, which always happens. And, we process it as we go. And hopefully, for some it meant something to them, and hopefully for others we can learn and, grow from it.
Speaking of yourself personally, I know you mentioned there's mixed reactions. Did you listen to the words that the Pope spoke during his visit? Did they resonate for you? Was there anything meaningful in what you heard?
The words definitely resonated with me. He called these schools what they were. They were not schools for an education. They weren't schools to educate our children and to ensure that they went to university. That's not what these schools were for. They were for assimilation. They were to assimilate the child and basically take our culture, our language, to take everything that we know about who we are away. And he acknowledged that. And to me, that meant a lot, because now we're getting into this discussion of what they really were and the harmful impacts that they had on survivors. And, that was a turning point for me, because this was never acknowledged in the past. And to actually get to that point where, he's calling it a genocide, he called it, it was an assimilation of these children, that resonated with a lot of people, not the apology itself, but what these schools actually were.
Right. I guess also for those who didn't feel that the apology was enough, for folks in the Indigenous community that thought that, well, that's nice that you've said those words. What more are they calling for? What more do you think specifically from the Catholic Church needs to be done that's more substantive?
What's being called for is rescinding the doctrine of discovery. Personally, I don't know how this is going to help people. I don't know if it's an ask that's actually going to be doable in my lifetime. They're just asking for things that just seem like we cannot achieve that. We need to start asking for more tangible things like treatment centers, counseling, elders, getting these programs into our communities. That's what we need to start asking for. And these are things that are much needed today.
Yes, great points. Okay, we're going to take a very short break and we're going to be back right after these messages. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking about the Pope's visit to Canada to apologize for the Catholic Church's role in the Indian residential school system. We've got Melissa Mbarki from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute here. Melissa, we were talking about the nature of the apology and how sufficient it was. I wondered if you had any thoughts on the nature of the Pope's apology on behalf of the Church compared to the Government of Canada and apologies that have been issued by Canadian governments for their role in residential schools.
So the big difference that I see is that when Canada made the apology, it was right before compensation was issued to the survivors. So there was something behind that apology. With the Pope's apology, it was just that. It was an apology. There was no discussion. There was some discussion on, looking further into some of the cases or into some of the abuse claims. But aside from that, there wasn't really a discussion on, how are we going to help Indigenous communities? What's our next step forward? And it was really lacking to me in that regard. I would have liked to see more, more discussion on these are our next steps. This is what the church plans to do. I would have liked to see more tangible items spoken in terms of how we can help communities.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier as well when you were talking about people who are asking for more than the words. The words are important and they're meaningful, but it also comes down to, frankly, dollars and cents to support, to help sort of address some of those wrongs. So is that, in your view, a fair argument that the Catholic Church, a lot of people have pointed out, it's a very wealthy organization, that if they have the resources available, that they should be using some of those resources to try and address some of the things they now acknowledge that were wrong?
Exactly. I don't know, how many people have seen a residential school close up or even have walked through one. These are massive buildings. Like these are huge, well-built buildings, and they lasted for 100 plus years. Like the one on my community is still standing today. If they could come into our communities and invest in these massive buildings, why can't they come back and build us a treatment center? Why can't they come back and build a youth facility or something that's genuinely going to help these communities? Even something as simple as investing in language for the community. This would be a start. I mean, it doesn't cost a whole lot of money to hold a language session twice a week. Like that doesn't cost a lot, or to even have an elder of readily available to survivors. That doesn't cost a lot. So it's items like this that I would really advocate for in communities. Like this is something that would help the people not only heal, but it would also help the communities, move forward from drug addictions, and it would help communities move forward from violent crimes. And these are things that we're dealing with today that are a result of the residential schools.
You mentioned the physical buildings there, and I just wondered your thoughts. What should be done with these buildings? Do you think they should be kept as reminders of what happened? Do you think they could have other purposes? Should they be demolished? Like, what in your view is the best use of the actual schools themselves?
I've seen schools used for the community, like they use them for classrooms, they use them for, office space, even because that's lacking as well in our community. I can only speak to the one on my community. We've used it for different educational programs. We've used it to, help children, to stabilize children who were, coming out of the foster care system or going into the foster care system. So we've had multi-use. We've used that building throughout the years for various things. What I would like to see it used as today is a museum, because people just won't get it until they walk through it. You won't know what a residential school was until you see these rooms and you can picture 25, 30 children in them. It won't hit you until you actually see what they were for and where these children for 100 plus years lived. And I would like to see mine converted into a museum, and it's been an ask from my community. We just haven't had the funds or the resources to actually make that into a reality. And the building's pretty sound. Like it's structurally, it's very strong, and it's something that's doable, but we just don't have the resources to move forward with it.
Yes, good point. Very quickly, we got about 30 seconds, but because of the location of a lot of these schools, a lot of Canadians may never come into contact with them anyway. What do you think about the idea of perhaps building a replica at sort of the Canadian Museum of History or something, so that more Canadians will be able to see exactly what it was like?
We have tons of pictures out there. Like there are tons of pictures in the archives, and just seeing the picture doesn't do it. You would have to physically walk through this building to know what it was, and that's kind of what I advocate for. Come to my reserve, come and walk through this old building. You will see what it was, and you'll see where children lived.
Fair enough. We're going to take a short break and be right back. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking about the Pope's visit and apology for the Catholic Church's role in the Indian residential school system with Melissa Mbarki from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Melissa, you've written a great deal on the need for Indigenous Canadians to take a forward-looking view when it comes to things like reconciliation and building a future within Canada. In that context, do you think that the Pope's apology helps advance that goal?
I think it does. When you bring in, the Pope, who, in the Catholic Church is fairly large in Canada, and you start to merge Indigenous people into these discussions, you start to build relationships, and that's the whole purpose of reconciliation, is for us to build these relationships and to share ideas on what the next steps are going forward. Like I don't have all the answers. We need the answers of 100 plus people to figure out how we're going to move forward. So I think having these discussions with people outside of our communities is beneficial, because they may have the answers that we don't, and vice versa.
I wanted to sort of speak about reconciliation more broadly. It's certainly an issue that when I think back to my time in sort of elementary school and high school, it was, Indigenous issues were not very high on the radar. I think it's fair to say they're higher on the radar today than 20 or 30 years ago. And this government in particular, has insisted that it places a very high priority on reconciliation. I want to get your thoughts on whether you think the current government has moved the needle on improving the lives of Indigenous Canadians.
It has and it hasn't. I mean, they've allotted quite a bit of money for different programs like housing, for example. How do we know that money is going to communities? There's no accountability to track the spending and to say, we've built X amount of houses on Melissa's home reserve. There's no way to track this. And that goes for everything else, whether it's money for water, whether it's compensation for, water. We don't know, even from an Indigenous perspective, like we don't know how this money is going to our reserves. And my reserve looks exactly the same as when I left it 20 years ago. So that should give you a picture on, how well of a job they're doing. And if something hadn't changed in my community, it's not changing in a whole lot of other communities as well. So we need to start having accountability measures on every level of government, whether it's the federal government or First Nations governments. We need to have some accountability so that we can say, yes, this money was well spent. It went to where it should, and these communities are thriving because of it.
So if I can paraphrase what you're saying, of course, money is part of the issue. These communities need money, but it's also a matter of how the money's spent, making sure the money is spent well, and having a degree of accountability to those communities that they know and can see where the money is going.
Yes, that's definitely it. Right now, we don't have that. So, right now, there's really no way of saying whether their initiatives helped us or not. I mean, there's no way you can say, yes, this helped community X when you have no way to measure it. And I think we need to start changing that narrative and give communities a little bit more autonomy in how it's spent. How the government says it should be spent is different from how we think it should be spent. We want community programs. And if we don't have community programs, how are we going to say this was successful in any way? So I definitely think, there's a lot of moving parts to it, but we definitely have to start somewhere, and that somewhere is accountability on everybody's end.
Speaking of the accountability point, is it what would you suggest to improve accountability? Is it a question of Is it a question of the federal government being accountable to local sort of members on the reserve? Is it the sort of reserve leadership and leadership being accountable to members? Is it both? And is it, I guess a related question is, the government, if they're putting money forward, are you saying that they have money, but often they're not spending it on the same things that members of the community would want to see it spent on?
Yes, there's definitely no consultation prior. Like you wouldn't see somebody come into our community and say, "What do you need?" We tell them what they need or what we need, and then they come back with something different. We often see that happening, especially even with water, something as simple as getting running water to a community. So there's a lot of broken pieces in between that we need to start fixing and that we need to start removing some of the red tape so that we can get services, even something as basic as water, quickly to our communities. It shouldn't take 10 years. It should take a month, if that. So we need to start, being accountable to our people, and we need to start listening. That's the whole part of reconciliation, is that we're not listened to. People have ideas for us and then they run with it without even consulting us and asking us what we need.
That's the road to good intentions right there. Thanks, Melissa. We're going to take a short break and be right back. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking with Melissa Mbarki from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute about the Pope's visit to Canada to apologize on behalf of the Catholic Church's role in residential schools, and about reconciliation more broadly. Melissa, we were talking about the federal government and the sort of the good things and the not so effective things they've been doing. You mentioned programs, and you mentioned the fact that the government is often bringing money to the table, but they're not focused on the same sorts of priorities. Can you sketch out some of the types of programs that you think would be particularly beneficial to Indigenous communities?
So I grew up in a rural community. We did not have any kind of after school activity. We did not have anything that kept us busy. So a lot of my friends, in our early teens, they were getting into trouble and they were doing things that they shouldn't do. And they had nothing else to do, and a lot of it stemmed from boredom. I see the same kind of things happening today in my community. Kids are bored. Give them something to do. Let's get them, some programs, some language programs. Let's get them some sports programs. Let's help them, be successful in life and give them a skill that they will use when they're an adult. Another thing is elder services. Our elders are slowly leaving us and they're taking their language and their knowledge with them. We don't have a way to capture this for our communities. So that's a really big worry. That's one of my biggest worries right now is, being left without that knowledge. And there's no way of us capturing that. We don't have the money, we don't have the resources to, get this knowledge or to save this knowledge. And it's cultural programs, these dancing, singing, like these would really help young people today. And we don't have any of this in our communities. And it would just take very little spending, very little money that would benefit an entire generation of kids. And, we don't have the resources for it because we have bigger things on our plate like water that we have to deal with. So, we need to get investments into these communities. We need to see healthy children, healthy adults. And that's the only way that we're going to thrive. And that's the only way we're going to move beyond residential schools and the effects of them.
I wanted to get your thoughts too on economic opportunity for Indigenous communities. We've seen there's sort of wide variance throughout Canada. Some communities are doing very well, others are really struggling. What do you think government can do to help improve the economic opportunity for especially those communities that don't seem to have much right now?
Financial literacy, energy literacy, this goes a long way in our communities. If we can get education and we can get, the knowledge out there, we wouldn't have, such biased opinions on certain things, and that's due to the lack of the education. And, if we can get programs, training programs in there to help people, I mean, that would just move mountains in a lot of ways. It would get people working. We would get people in the, labor market. We would see small businesses start up. Like there's so many economic opportunities that are out there, but we often we often listen to outside views that aren't necessarily true. There's a lot of misinformation out there that people buy into. So how do we combat that? We combat it with education and, the skills and training that people will need.
Now, Melissa, with respect to economic opportunity in the energy sector in particular, what could governments do to help improve economic opportunity in that sector for Indigenous communities?
I think what governments could do is stop putting barriers in front of us when it comes to the energy sector. They don't realize that we're currently working with operators to reduce emissions. So, whether that's through carbon capture, hydrogen, LNG, there's solutions out there that will help reduce emissions in Canada. And when you look at some of the bills and acts that have gone in, this has actually hindered, our ability to participate in large scale projects. I definitely think the government could stop, putting these barriers and consult with us, because there is a whole other argument on the other side of the fence that they're not hearing. And I think bringing educated, people into these conversations will not only help Indigenous communities, but Canadians as well.
Well, thank you very much for those thoughts, Melissa. This was a great chat about a very important issue, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Obviously, this is something that's going to be a long road ahead for a lot of Canadians, especially Indigenous Canadians, but it's good to hear some positivity. I want to thank you, the viewers, for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on Our Canada, Our Future.